Hi boys and girls, today we're going to do a making meaning lesson with the story Flight. So a little background on the story. It's a true story about Charles Lindbergh and his flight from New York to Paris in 1927. He was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. 1927 was a time where the airlines were fairly new. It was a new invention. And only before that, the Wright brothers' famous first flight of a motorized airplane occurred in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So people rarely saw airplanes overhead. His flight made him famous around the world, and it changed the way that people thought about air travel. So during today's lesson, I want you to think about the point of view, who's telling the story, and I also want you to think about our last unit where we talked about making inferences. So today, some of the vocabulary words are cockpit, which if you've traveled, you know that the cockpit is the area in front of the plane where the pilot sits. Aloft will be referred to as going up in the air. Periscope is a tube that contains mirrors that enables someone to see around things. Drones are something that makes a continuous noise. The throttle is the part of the airplane that they pull to make and to control the speed. And sod is grass. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the word aviators, and that's someone who flies an airplane. So here's our story, Flight, by Robert Burleigh and illustrated by Mike Wimmer. It is 1927 and his name is Charles Lindbergh. Later they'll call him Lone Eagle. Later they will call him Lucky Lindy. But now it is May 20th, 1927, and he is standing in the still, dark dawn. He watches rain drizzle down on the airfield and in his small airplane. The airplane has a name painted on the side of it, and it says Spirit of St. Louis. So if we're talking about the point of view, you don't hear him saying I. So they're saying he. So we know that that's the third person. He watches rain drizzle down on the airfield. So keep that in mind as we read the story. Lindbergh is nearly as tall as the plane itself, and yet he's only about to attempt what no one has done before, to fly without stop from New York to Paris, France. Over 3,600 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, all alone. He climbs into the box-like cockpit that will hold only home for many, many hours. He clicks on the engine, he listens to its catches and gurgles and roars. A few friends are here to say goodbye. There are only a few feet away, and yet to Lindbergh, how far off they seem. They look up at him and wave, "Good luck and keep safe." A telephone wire stretches across the far end of the field. To touch the wire will plunge the plane on the ground. There is enough extra fuel in the front of the cockpit, but because of this, Lindbergh cannot see straight ahead. Will the Spirit of St. Louis, with over 5,000 pounds, rise to the air? To keep the plane lighter, Lindbergh is leaving behind his radio and parachute. Will that be enough? He has been up all night getting ready. A thought runs back and forth through his mind. It is still possible to turn back, to return home. And yet another thought is stronger. I have been waiting my entire life for this flight. Lindbergh lowers his goggles and nods his head. Go! Men on each side push to help the plane roll over soggy ground. The little plane pumps forward, gaining speed. The wheels leave the ground and then touch back. The plane seems to hop, making this the last bow to earth. On the third try, it stays aloft. It soars above the wire only by 20 feet. The Spirit of St. Louis rises in the air. It is 7:52 in the morning, New York time. Lindbergh points his plane towards the Atlantic and beyond, towards Paris, over 30 hours away. He gazes down in the morning light. How far off Paris seems across the long ocean. He plans to follow the coastline, flying northeast. The land's edge looks to him like green fingers pointing at the dark sea. To see ahead, Lindbergh pokes small homemade periscope out to sea of the cockpit. Sometimes he flies very close to the water, just 10 feet above the waves. He knows that this low height, the plane glides more smoothly. The plane drones on. It cruises at about 100 miles an hour. At this rate, he will have enough fuel to reach his destination, but only if he stays on course. Besides him in the cockpit is a little book. He keeps a diary as he goes, all day long, hour by hour. It is as if he was speaking to himself. He wants to remember everything, because no one else will ever really know. At 12:08, he flies above Nova Scotia. Just after 4, he flies above the coast of Newfoundland. At dusk, he looks down and sees icebergs. In his diary, he calls them white pyramids. White patches on the blackened sea. He wonders what lies ahead. The sun sets far behind the plane. Lindbergh flies over St. John's, Newfoundland, and last point of land in North America. Now he can no longer follow the land's edge for direction. He must chart his course carefully. The slightest movement could send him miles off course and risk the fuel supply. He follows 2 compasses and the stars to navigate. As long as the sky is clear, he is safe, but he must stay awake. He writes, "Now I must cross not 1, but 2 oceans, one by night and one of water. Time passes slowly. It's almost 9 o'clock at night. Lindbergh's 13th hour in the air. He has completed 1/3 of the flight." He moves through dense, curling fog, lit ghostly white by the moon, and suddenly enters a huge storm cloud. The plane shimmers, moving up and down, and the uniform blackens. He wonders, can I fly above it? Slowly, he soars to 10,500 feet. Here it is clear, but very, very cold. He extends his arm outside the cockpit and feels stinging pinpricks. He clicks on his small flashlight and peers out. Heavy ice has formed on the plane's wings. He cannot risk his instruments icing up. He points the Spirit of St. Louis back down. The wings quiver as they slice through the turbulent air. The fog continues, but now, at least, the air is warmer. The ice begins to melt, and Lindbergh roars ahead, through the fog and clouds, to Paris, only 2,000 miles away. Space and time and deep, deep darkness. It is in the other side of midnight, the loneliest hours. Lindbergh has been awake for almost 50 hours straight. He's closer to Europe than America. Now there's no turning back, only moving forward. He dozes for a minute and then jerks awake. One of the plane's wings is dipping crazily. In a sudden rush of fear, he grabs for the throttle. He gropes for the steady center of his heart, and with his heart pounding. As he feels the leveling wings, he lets out a breath. He repeats over and over to himself, "I must not fall asleep. I must not fall asleep." Here, high above the churning ocean, to sleep is to die. There are some of the things to stay awake. He leans his face near the open window to feel the cold air. He holds his eyelids up with his fingers to keep them from closing. He remembers growing up on the farm in Minnesota. He remembers being a trick pilot and walking out into the plane's wings. He remembers the people of St. Louis who paid for his plane. Sometimes he takes a sip of water from his canteen. He also has 5 chicken sandwiches with him. That's all the food he brought. But he eats nothing. It is easier to stay awake with an empty stomach. His body cries for sleep. He loses track of time. The night is endless. He wishes for the sun to rise. Dawn comes slowly, growing out of the gray mist. Will the fog ever end, he wonders? The clouds change color, from green to gray, and from gray to red and gold. Lindbergh has been in the air for 23 hours. He is 2,300 miles from New York and 1,300 miles to go. He feels completely alone in the world. He feels as if he were flying through all eternity. He tries to stay on course, but because of his constant curving route, he is not always sure. Here and there, the clouds seem to break apart. He sees far below him the ocean, from high up in the sky like a great blue shaft with gray walls. Then he flies into the clouds again, into unchanging mist. The day comes, brighter and warmer. Sometimes he imagines he sees land. Nope, it's only flickering shapes of the clouds, and water, 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 endless water. It is 7:30 in the morning in New York, and Paris is over 1,000 miles away. There is no alternative but death and failure, he writes. Flying closer to the water, Lindbergh sights a porpoise leaping above the waves. He spies a seagull. Then fishing boats. Something quickens in Lindbergh's blood. He guides the spirit of St. Louis carefully down and down to just above a boat. He throttles the plane and calls out the question. Which way, he shouts, is Ireland? He hopes for a word. He longs for a wave. A warmer welcome back to the fellowship of men. It is 10:52 in the morning, New York time. Lindbergh sees in the distance low mountains. Now he is awake with new hope. Land is near. He quickly unfolds the map across his knees. He flies over the southern tip of Ireland. He is right on course. Cows gaze off in the green hills. People in the horse-drawn carts look up and wave. He could land in Ireland, but he decides to go on. He wants to complete his dream. It is 1:52 in the afternoon, New York time, as he crosses England. It is Lindbergh's 31st hour in the air. He crosses more water. The wide day is slowly ebbing towards twilight. Then he sees land, the coast of France. Children run out of their houses and watch him fly by. He continues on. Then Lindbergh spies a glow ahead of him. Paris, I am here, I'm here. A great joy wells up inside of him. For a moment, he does not want the flight to ever end. Huddled inside his tiny box house, flooded in the dense hum of the airplane's engine, he loves his strange closeness to the clouds and sky. It is 4:52 in the afternoon, New York time. Lindbergh's 34th hour in the air. From above, all Lindbergh sees are many, many small lights. But now he must concentrate on just one thing. The sod coming up to meet me. Closer, closer, closer. The plane touches the ground. It bounces, rolls, hugs the solid earth. It is 10:22, Paris time. The flight has taken 33 and a half hours. Thousands of people are running towards the plane. For a moment, Lindbergh is dazed. It seems to him as if he were drowning in a great sea. People surrounded the plane cheering, but Lindbergh can hardly hear them. His ears seem to have been deafened by the hours of roaring engines. Crowds pull him out of the cockpit. Men and women are calling his name over and over. They carry them on their shoulders. Others begin to tear pieces of the plane. More than anything else, Lindbergh wants to save the spirit of St. Louis. His first words are the question, "Are there any mechanics here?" But no one speaks English. Finally, 2 French aviators arrive to help him. Policemen guard the plane. The aviators take Lindbergh away from the still cheering crowd. In the airfield's hangar, he tells the story of his flight to the other pilots. The cramped cockpit, all the loneliness, the long, long night. Meanwhile, unknown to Lindbergh, newspaper headlines all over the world were beginning to blazon the news. American hero safe in Paris. Lindbergh is driven off to the American embassy. He answers more questions about his flight. He has not slept in over 60 hours. Finally, at 4:15 in the morning, he goes to bed. When he awakes, his life will be forever changed. When he awakes, there will be a huge parade and medals and speeches. He will be the most famous man in the world. It is the year 1927. It is 1927, and his name is Charles Lindbergh. Hope you enjoyed the story of flight, and be on the lookout for some questions that you'll need to answer for the story. Have a great day.